The Dark Rising. Chapter 1. The Shadow in the City. The rain poured down in Iron City, washing over the cracked pavements and neon-lit streets. It was a city caught in the grip of darkness, a place where the line between law and lawlessness had long been blurred. The city's towering skyscrapers loomed like guardians of secrets, their windows glowing dimly against the murky night sky. Deep in the heart of this city, in an alley barely touched by streetlights, shadows moved silently. They were not ordinary shadows. They belonged to a legend known only in whispers, to a figure who moved with purpose and skill, the Shade. No one knew who the Shade really was. Stories painted him as a ghost, a nightmare in black, a vigilante whose very name sent shivers down the spines of criminals. He was both feared and admired, yet never truly seen. Tonight, he was on the prowl, patrolling the alleys and side streets as he did every night, his senses heightened, his eyes scanning for signs of trouble. In a city as corrupt as Iron City, trouble was never hard to find. A group of masked men huddled near an abandoned warehouse at the far end of the alley. They laughed, their voices carrying over the sound of rain, and tossed a duffel bag filled with cash back and forth. They were thugs working for the Iron Fist, a criminal organization that had recently started claiming territory in Iron City. Rumor had it that the Iron Fist was led by a brutal mastermind named Draven, though few had ever seen him and lived to tell the tale. The Shade watched from above, crouched on a fire escape. Rain dripped from the edge of his hood as he observed the group, his eyes narrowed. He adjusted the earpiece in his helmet, filtering out the sound of the rain so he could listen to the conversation below. "I heard the Iron Fist is planning something big," one of the thugs muttered. "Draven's got this whole city in his grip." Another thug chuckled. "Doesn't matter who runs it as long as we get paid." The Shade felt a chill, not from the rain, but from the mention of Draven's name. Draven was not like the other criminals he'd faced. He was ruthless, cunning, and had eyes everywhere. It was said that he had spies in the government, in the police force, even in the hospitals. Draven didn't just control crime, he controlled the city's very infrastructure. The Shade had spent months tracking down every lead he could find on the Iron Fist, but he had never been able to get close to Draven. The man was like a ghost, just as elusive as the Shade himself. But tonight, something felt different. The Shade could sense it, a tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen. He wasn't going to let this chance slip away. He reached into his belt and pulled out a smoke grenade. With a flick of his wrist, he dropped it into the middle of the group below. The grenade hissed as thick smoke billowed out, engulfing the thugs in a gray cloud. They coughed and stumbled, disoriented, as the Shade descended from above like a shadow descending upon them. Before they could react, he was among them, moving like a whirlwind. A fist to one man's jaw sent him sprawling. A swift kick to another's knee brought him crashing down. The Shade moved with precision, his every strike calculated, every movement swift and deadly. Within moments, the thugs lay on the ground, groaning and defeated. One of them tried to crawl away, but the Shade stepped on his hand, pinning him in place. He crouched down, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. "Tell me about Draven." The Shade's voice was a low, menacing whisper. The thug's eyes widened in fear. I don't know anything. I swear." The Shade pressed down harder, and the man winced. "You know something, or you wouldn't be here. Start talking." The thug hesitated, then stammered, "All I know is, Draven's planning something big. He's going to release something in the city, a virus or something that could wipe out half of Iron City. But I don't know when or how." The Shade's mind raced. A virus. Draven wasn't just after control, he wanted to destroy. If what this thug was saying was true, Iron City was in far more danger than anyone had realized. He released the man's hand and stood up, his thoughts swirling. He needed to find Draven, and he needed to do it fast. But Iron City was a maze of secrets, and Draven was a master of hiding in plain sight. This wasn't going to be easy. As the Shade turned to leave, something caught his eye. On the wall behind the warehouse was a symbol, scrawled hastily in red paint. It was a twisted design that resembled a fist gripping a dagger. The Shade recognized it instantly. It was the emblem of the Iron Fist. The mark was new, wet with paint, as if it had been left for him to find. A message, or perhaps a challenge. The Shade felt a thrill of anticipation. Draven was taunting him, daring him to come closer, to step into his trap. But the Shade had no intention of backing down. He was the city's only hope, the last line of defense against the darkness that threatened to consume it. He activated a small device on his wrist, sending a signal back to his base. His headquarters was hidden in an abandoned section of the subway, a place where no one would think to look. It was there that he kept his weapons, his gadgets, and the files he had collected on Iron City's criminal underworld. Tonight, he would add to those files. He would gather every scrap of information he could find on Draven, on the Iron Fist, and on this so-called virus. The clock was ticking, and every second brought the city closer to disaster. The Shade slipped back into the shadows, his form blending seamlessly with the darkness. He moved quickly, disappearing down the alley as silently as he had appeared. Behind him, the defeated thugs groaned in pain, too broken to give chase, too terrified to call for help. Iron City's protector was on the hunt, and no one, not even Draven, could escape his reach. For the Shade, the night was far from over. The real battle had just begun. Chapter 2. The Encounter with Draven. The Shade slipped silently through Iron City, weaving his way through alleys and rooftops, his thoughts focused on a single name, Draven. The information he'd gathered the previous night had left him with more questions than answers. A virus that could wipe out half of the city. The implications were terrifying. Draven wasn't just a criminal, he was a force of destruction, willing to bring Iron City to its knees. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, the Shade felt an urgency that was different from any he'd ever known. This time, failure wasn't an option. He had spent the last few hours investigating, picking up scraps of information from his contacts across the city. The rumor of a virus had spread fast, whispered in the dark corners of Iron City. But concrete details were scarce, and he needed more than whispers. As dawn approached, the Shade finally picked up a lead. One of his contacts, a hacker known as Binary, had reached out with a tip. A deal was going down tonight in the Industrial District, a place where Iron City's power grids and communication lines converged. It was a perfect cover for an underground operation, and if Binary's information was right, Draven himself would be there. The Shade prepared quickly, reloading his gadgets and ensuring his armor was reinforced. He knew the risks. Draven was not an ordinary criminal. He had eyes everywhere and a network that rivaled the city's own law enforcement. If he was going to confront Draven tonight, he needed to be ready for anything. As night fell, the Shade made his way to the Industrial District, moving silently through the shadows until he reached an abandoned warehouse. Through a crack in the metal door, he saw figures moving inside, their forms shadowy and indistinct. It was a group of men, and from their nervous glances and tense stances, it was clear they were waiting for someone. The Shade slipped in through a side window, positioning himself on a metal beam high above the group. He watched them closely, counting 7 men, all heavily armed, all wearing the symbol of the Iron Fist on their jackets. They seemed uneasy, shifting from foot to foot as they muttered to each other. Then, a presence filled the room. Draven entered from the far side, his footsteps echoing across the concrete floor. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a rough, scarred face and an aura that commanded fear. His eyes scanned the room, missing nothing. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to being in control. The Shade's heartbeat quickened as he watched. This was the man who had haunted his thoughts, the man who held Iron City in his grip. Draven's voice was low, but it carried across the warehouse with ease. "Is everything ready?" Draven asked one of the men, his tone sharp, leaving no room for error. "Yes, sir," the man replied nervously. "The first phase is ready to launch tomorrow. Once we activate it, there's no going back." "Good." Draven's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Iron City thinks it's safe behind its walls, but they have no idea what's coming. When the virus spreads, the city will crumble, and they'll beg me for mercy." The Shade clenched his fists, his mind racing. Tomorrow. That was all the time he had to stop this madness. He couldn't wait any longer, he had to act now. Without hesitation, he threw a smoke grenade down to the warehouse floor. It exploded with a loud hiss, filling the room with thick, gray smoke. The thugs scrambled in confusion, shouting to each other as they tried to regain their bearings. But the Shade was already moving, descending from the metal beam like a shadow, his figure barely visible through the smoke. He struck fast, taking down the first thug with a swift blow to the temple. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even realized what had happened. Another thug rushed toward him, swinging a metal pipe, but the Shade sidestepped and delivered a powerful kick to his chest, sending him sprawling. In the chaos, Draven's voice cut through like a knife. "It's him. Take him down." The remaining thugs raised their weapons, firing blindly into the smoke, but the Shade moved too quickly. He was a blur, dodging bullets and disarming his opponents with ease. Within moments, the last of Draven's men lay incapacitated on the floor, leaving only Draven standing. The Shade turned to face him, his breathing steady, his gaze cold. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two predators sizing each other up. Then Draven's lips curled into a mocking smile. "I've heard about you," Draven said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The city's little ghost, hiding in the shadows, pretending to make a difference. But you're nothing more than a nuisance." The Shade's jaw tightened. "I don't care what you think of me. You're not releasing that virus." Draven laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the empty warehouse. "You think you can stop me? You don't even know what you're up against. You're just one man, fighting a battle you can't win." Without warning, Draven lunged, his fist swinging with brutal force. The Shade dodged the first blow, but Draven was faster than he'd anticipated. The second punch connected with his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through his arm. He stumbled back, barely regaining his balance as Draven advanced on him. The Shade countered with a swift kick, aiming for Draven's knee, but Draven blocked it effortlessly, grabbing his leg and twisting him off balance. The Shade hit the ground hard, the impact rattling his bones. Draven loomed over him, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "You're out of your depth," Draven sneered. "This city is mine, I own it, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." But the Shade wasn't finished yet. With a surge of determination, he rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding Draven's next attack. He sprang to his feet, his mind focused, his body moving with renewed purpose. This wasn't just a fight, it was a test of will, a battle for the soul of Iron City. As they clashed again, their movements became a deadly dance, each strike and counterstrike filled with intensity. The Shade fought with every ounce of strength he had, but Draven was relentless, his attacks brutal and unyielding. For every hit the Shade landed, Draven returned with twice the force. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Shade managed to land a powerful blow to Draven's jaw, staggering him. Draven stumbled back, his eyes blazing with fury. But before the Shade could press his advantage, Draven reached into his coat and pulled out a small device. With a smirk, he pressed a button, and a deafening alarm blared throughout the warehouse. "You got lucky tonight," Draven said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "But this isn't over. I'll be seeing you soon, and next time, you won't walk away." With that, Draven disappeared into the shadows, leaving the Shade alone in the empty warehouse. The alarm continued to blare, but the Shade paid it no mind. He knew Draven's words weren't just a threat, they were a promise. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Chapter 3. The Betrayal. Iron City never truly slept. Even in the quiet hours of dawn, the hum of neon lights and the distant rumble of traffic filled the air, creating a constant buzz that seemed to reflect the city's restless nature. In a hidden corner of the city, in an underground lair known only to a few, the Shade was deep in thought. The events of the previous night had left him more determined, and more uneasy, than ever before. Draven's words still echoed in his mind. "You got lucky tonight, but this isn't over." The Shade knew that the battle was only beginning. He had discovered Draven's intention to unleash a deadly virus upon Iron City, but he still didn't know the full extent of the plan or when it would be put into motion. He needed help, someone he could trust, someone with the resources and connections he lacked. There was only one person who fit that description, Detective Lila Storm. Lila was one of the few people in the Iron City Police Department who hadn't succumbed to corruption. Her reputation was as spotless as her record, and the Shade had worked with her in the past, though their relationship was more of mutual respect than true partnership. She was brave, intelligent, and relentless in her pursuit of justice, and the Shade knew she shared his desire to bring down Draven and his empire. If anyone could help him stop Draven, it was her. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the city skyline, the Shade found himself standing in a quiet alley outside Lila's favorite coffee shop. He had slipped her a message the night before, using a burner phone to ensure no trace was left. She'd responded quickly, agreeing to meet in the early hours, away from prying eyes. When Lila finally appeared, she wore her usual attire, dark jeans, a leather jacket, and an air of quiet determination. Her sharp eyes met his, showing no surprise at his presence. She had grown used to his sudden appearances. "You're getting bold, calling me in the daylight," she remarked, her tone half teasing but her gaze serious. The Shade nodded, his voice low. "We don't have time to waste, Lila. Draven's planning something big, something that could destroy Iron City. I need your help." Her eyes narrowed, her expression shifting to one of concern. "What do you mean?" The Shade explained what he'd learned. The virus, the threat to the city, and Draven's plan to release it. Lila listened intently, her expression darkening with every word. When he finished, she crossed her arms, her face set in grim resolve. "If what you're saying is true, we have to act now," she said. "But Draven has connections everywhere. He's got half the police force in his pocket, and he's paid off most of the politicians. We're going to need solid proof, something we can use to expose him." The Shade nodded. "I know. I was hoping you might have a lead on where we could find that proof." Lila hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. She glanced around, as if afraid of being overheard, even in the deserted alley. "There is something. I've been tracking a few of Draven's men, low-level enforcers. They've been meeting at an old storage facility by the docks. I haven't been able to get close enough to see what they're up to, but it could be where they're storing the virus." The Shade considered this. The docks were one of the few places in Iron City where law enforcement rarely ventured, a maze of abandoned warehouses and shipping containers that provided the perfect cover for illegal activity. It made sense that Draven would choose such a location. "Then that's where we start," the Shade said. "Tonight, we'll go in together. I'll handle the heavy lifting, but I'll need you to cover the exits. If we're lucky, we might catch someone with information on the virus." Lila nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Shade, there's something you should know." She hesitated, looking away. "Draven's men. They've been asking questions about me. I think someone in the department might have tipped him off that I'm working against him." The Shade's gaze hardened. "You think there's a mole?" She nodded slowly. "I don't know who it is, but someone's been feeding him information. It's why I've been so careful. If Draven finds out we're working together, he won't get the chance," the Shade interrupted, his voice firm. "We're going to end this before he even knows what hit him." That night, as darkness fell over Iron City once again, the Shade and Lila met at the docks, their figures blending seamlessly with the shadows. The air was thick with tension, the distant hum of machinery and the occasional sound of water lapping against the docks the only noises breaking the silence. They moved swiftly, their steps silent as they approached the storage facility. The building was old, its windows cracked and its walls covered in graffiti. The Shade's instincts were on high alert, his senses sharpened by years of experience. He gestured for Lila to follow him to the side entrance, where he quickly picked the lock and slipped inside. Inside, the facility was dimly lit, with rows of metal shelves filled with crates and barrels. The air was thick with the scent of oil and dust, and the faint hum of a generator echoed through the space. The Shade scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he spotted several figures moving in the shadows. Lila raised her weapon, her eyes focused. They moved as a team, slipping through the aisles, inching closer to a group of men gathered around a large crate. One of them was holding a tablet, displaying information that the Shade couldn't quite make out from this distance. "Do you see it?" Lila whispered. The Shade nodded. "They're definitely planning something. Let's get closer." Just as they moved forward, a faint click echoed through the air, a sound that only someone trained in combat would recognize. The Shade froze, his eyes darting around. In an instant, he realized what it was, a tripwire. Before he could react, a blinding light flooded the room, and a booming voice echoed from above. Well, the Shade and Detective Storm. I was wondering when you'd show up." The Shade's heart sank as he looked up to see Draven standing on a metal catwalk above them, flanked by armed guards. His face twisted into a smug grin as he looked down at them, clearly pleased with himself. "You thought you could sneak into my operation and stop me?" Draven sneered. I knew you'd come. You're both so predictable. The Shade's mind raced, searching for an escape, but they were surrounded. He glanced at Lila, who looked equally trapped, her eyes wide with realization. Draven continued, his tone mocking. You didn't really think I wouldn't be prepared, did you? Detective Storm, you really should have chosen your allies more wisely. Lila's face drained of color as Draven's words sank in. What are you talking about? Draven smirked. Oh, you didn't know. One of your precious colleagues has been keeping me informed about all of your little moves. Everything you thought you knew, every plan you made, I knew about it. The Shade felt a surge of anger as he realized the depth of Draven's control. They had walked right into his trap, and now their lives, and the fate of Iron City, hung in the balance. But even as Draven's guards closed in, the Shade's mind remained focused. He wasn't about to give up. Not yet, not when there was still a chance to turn the tables. With a quick, silent signal to Lila, he prepared for what could be his final stand against Draven and his forces. Chapter 4. Breaking the Trap. The air was thick with tension as Draven's guards closed in around the Shade and Detective Lila Storm, their weapons raised, their expressions cold. The Shade's mind was racing, calculating every possible escape route, every weakness he could exploit. He could feel Lila's panic beside him, though she fought hard to keep her composure. They were outnumbered, surrounded on all sides by armed men with no clear exit in sight. Draven's voice echoed from the catwalk above, dripping with mockery. Did you really think you could walk into my domain and just take what you wanted? He sneered, looking down at them with an air of supreme confidence. You're both nothing more than pests. And pests get exterminated. The Shade glanced around, his eyes scanning the room for anything he could use to their advantage. The storage facility was filled with metal crates, rusty machinery, and thick metal pipes running along the walls and ceiling. If he could just create a distraction. He leaned closer to Lila, his voice barely a whisper. Stay close and follow my lead. Whatever happens, don't stop moving. Lila gave a slight nod, her eyes flickering with renewed determination. She trusted him, even in the face of such overwhelming odds. In one swift motion, the Shade reached into his utility belt and pulled out a smoke bomb. He threw it down at their feet, and in an instant, thick clouds of smoke filled the room, obscuring them from view. The guards shouted in confusion, momentarily blinded, and in that split second of chaos, the Shade sprang into action. He grabbed Lila's hand and pulled her toward a stack of metal crates, ducking behind them as bullets ricocheted off the walls. The Shade moved quickly, his movements fluid and precise, guiding Lila through the maze of crates and machinery, staying just out of sight. Above them, Draven cursed. Loudly, his voice furious. Find them. Don't let them escape. The guards fanned out, their footsteps echoing through the facility as they searched for their targets. The Shade and Lila crouched behind a large crate, catching their breath. The smoke was beginning to clear, and they only had moments before they'd be exposed. We need to get to higher ground, the Shade whispered, his gaze flickering to the catwalk where Draven still stood, barking orders. If we can get above them, we might be able to turn this around. Lila nodded, glancing around for a way up. Her eyes landed on a nearby ladder leading up to a metal walkway along the side of the building. She pointed, and the Shade gave a quick nod of approval. They moved quickly, keeping low to avoid drawing attention, and climbed the ladder as quietly as they could. As they reached the top, the Shade could see Draven's guards still searching below, unaware of their position. He motioned for Lila to stay back while he crept forward along the catwalk, his eyes locked on Draven. Draven was pacing back and forth, his expression furious as he shouted orders into a communication device. No, I don't care how many resources it takes, find them. They're here somewhere. The Shade took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was his chance. He moved swiftly, closing the distance between himself and Draven. Just as he was about to reach him, one of the guards below looked up and spotted him. There, on the catwalk, the guard shouted, raising his weapon. Draven spun around, his eyes narrowing as he locked onto the Shade. His lips curled into a vicious smile. Well, look who decided to join us. The hero of Iron City. Without hesitation, Draven pulled a pistol from his coat and aimed it at the Shade. But the Shade was faster. He lunged forward, grabbing Draven's wrist and twisting it, forcing the gun to clatter to the ground. Draven snarled, throwing a punch, but the Shade dodged, his movements quick and precise. They grappled, each struggling for dominance, their movements a deadly dance on the narrow catwalk. Below them, the guards aimed their weapons, but they hesitated, afraid to hit their own boss. Lila, seeing an opportunity, drew her own weapon and aimed down at the guards below, firing a warning shot that echoed through the facility. "Nobody move," she shouted, her voice commanding. "The next shot won't be a warning." The guards froze, glancing nervously between each other. They were clearly loyal to Draven, but none of them seemed eager to risk their lives against the unyielding resolve in Lila's voice. Meanwhile, the Shade and Draven continued to struggle, each man refusing to yield. Draven was strong, his movements brutal and unrefined, while the Shade fought with a calculated grace, using his agility to stay one step ahead. With a sudden surge of strength, Draven managed to shove the Shade back, sending him teetering on the edge of the catwalk. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the Shade's balance wavered, and he nearly fell. But he caught himself just in time, his fingers gripping the edge of the railing. Draven loomed over him, a smug smile spreading across his face. "This is where it ends," he taunted, raising his foot to kick the Shade over the edge. But the Shade wasn't done yet. Just as Draven moved to strike, the Shade twisted his body, sweeping Draven's legs out from under him. Draven stumbled, his eyes widening in shock as he lost his balance and fell backward, landing hard on the metal floor of the catwalk. The Shade was on him in an instant, pinning him down. "It's over, Draven. Your reign of terror ends here." Draven laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think this changes anything? I have men everywhere, people who will carry on my work. Killing me won't save Iron City." The Shade's gaze hardened. "Maybe not, but it's a start." He raised his fist, ready to deliver the final blow, but he hesitated. He knew that killing Draven would make him no better than the man he despised. Instead, he glanced back at Lila, who was watching from across the catwalk, her expression unreadable. "Lila," he called, his voice steady. "Get the police. Make sure he's put away where he can't hurt anyone ever again." Lila nodded, lowering her weapon. She pulled out her radio, calling for backup. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air as police cars arrived at the docks, their lights flashing in the darkness. The guards, realizing they were outmatched, surrendered without a fight. Draven was handcuffed and led away, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. As he was escorted past the Shade, he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over. I'll find a way out. I'll be back." The Shade met his gaze with calm defiance. "Not if I have anything to say about it." As Draven was taken away, the Shade felt a surge of relief, mixed with exhaustion. The battle was over, for now. But he knew that Iron City was far from safe. There would always be others like Draven, people willing to exploit the city for their own gain. Lila approached him, her expression softening. "You did good tonight," she said quietly. "The city owes you." The Shade shook his head. "The city doesn't even know who I am. And that's the way it needs to be." He turned to leave, melting into the shadows once more. As he disappeared into the night, he knew that his work was far from done. The darkness still loomed over Iron City, and he would be there, always watching, always ready to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. For now, the city could sleep a little safer. And the Shade, its silent guardian, would be there when it needed him again. Chapter 5. A New Dawn. Iron City was silent in the early hours, as though it were holding its breath after the storm. The events of the previous night had already begun rippling through the city like an electric shock. Draven's arrest was the talk of the news, each headline speculating on the downfall of one of Iron City's most notorious criminals. To most, it was a shocking revelation that a man who held such influence had been brought down in the dead of night. But for the Shade, there was no sense of victory, no relief. He watched the sunrise from the edge of an old rooftop, his gaze tracing the familiar skyline. The fight had been brutal, but it felt far from over. Draven was in custody, but the Shade knew Iron City too well to believe that it would be enough. Draven's network ran deep, intertwined with the city's most powerful circles. And he had sworn revenge. The Shade's thoughts were interrupted by the quiet approach of Detective Lila Storm, who had climbed up to join him on the rooftop. She wore the faintest hint of a smile as she looked at him, but her eyes were tired, showing the strain of the past few days. "You really should get some rest, you know," she said softly, though there was a warmth in her voice. "You saved the city last night." The Shade shook his head. "Draven's gone, but the rot that allowed him to thrive is still here. Iron City isn't safe. Not yet." Lila sighed, crossing her arms as she leaned against the railing. "I know. I've spent years fighting it from the inside, trying to tear down that corruption brick by brick. But last night," she paused, her gaze turning distant. "Last night gave people hope. They need that, Shade. And they need you." He looked at her, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. He had never sought recognition, never wanted to be seen as a hero. His work had always been about something simpler, a drive to protect the innocent, to bring justice to a city that had forgotten what it meant. But as he looked out over Iron City, he saw it with fresh eyes, as though he were seeing its potential for the first time. "Hope," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "I never thought I'd hear that word used about this place." "People are already talking about you," Lila continued. "They're calling you a vigilante, but a hero, too." The Shade. "It's funny, I think they're finally realizing how much they needed someone like you." The Shade turned away from her, uncomfortable with the idea. Heroism isn't what this city needs. It needs change. Real change. And that won't happen if Draven's people are still pulling strings from the shadows. Lila nodded, her expression serious. "Agreed. Draven may be in custody, but his influence isn't. We've frozen his accounts and locked down his operations, but there are whispers already. His loyalists are regrouping, and they're not going to give up without a fight." The Shade's eyes narrowed. He had anticipated this. The defeat of one man wasn't enough to purge Iron City's corruption, it was embedded in the system itself. "Then we stay ahead of them. Track every asset, every connection, and dismantle them piece by piece." Lila looked at him with a glint of admiration. "I was hoping you'd say that. I don't think I can do it alone. And honestly, we make a pretty good team." The Shade allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "We do," he admitted. "But you're putting yourself at risk. Draven's supporters will want revenge on you more than anyone else." She shrugged, her resolve unwavering. "I can handle myself. And besides, I knew the risks when I signed up for this job. I'm not backing down now." There was a pause, filled with an unspoken understanding between them. In their shared silence, they both knew that they were standing on the edge of something bigger than themselves. The work ahead would be grueling, and the dangers greater than anything they had faced. But there was a sense of purpose between them, a resolve that seemed to sharpen in the face of adversity. "I'll need access to everything you can find on Draven's network," the Shade said, his voice low and focused. "Bank records, communications, anything that might give us leverage. We'll break his organization from the inside out." Lila nodded, already mentally cataloging the information she could gather. "I can pull some strings, but we'll need to be careful. Draven's influence reaches high up the chain. If we're not discreet, the entire operation could be compromised." The Shade's gaze remained steady. "Then we work in silence. No traces, no mistakes. If we do this right, no one will know we're even there." They agreed to start that very night, going through each piece of Draven's network with meticulous precision. They knew it would take weeks, perhaps even months, to unravel the full extent of his empire. But neither was deterred. They were bound by a shared purpose, a vision of a city free from the grip of those who sought to control it. As dawn broke over Iron City, Lila rose to leave, her silhouette casting a shadow against the pale morning light. She paused, glancing back at the Shade one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." He nodded, watching her disappear down the rooftop stairwell. He was left alone with his thoughts, the reality of his mission settling over him like a cloak. He wasn't the hero Iron City wanted, nor the one it deserved. He was simply the Shade, a figure who lived in the shadows, fighting to bring light to a city that had long forgotten what it meant. As he prepared to leave, he heard a faint rustling sound behind him. Instinctively, he turned, his senses on high alert, but as he scanned the empty rooftop, he saw nothing but the faint glimmer of sunlight reflecting off the city's glass towers. Just his mind playing tricks, he thought. The last remnants of a night filled with chaos and danger. But deep down, he knew the challenges weren't over. Draven's capture was only the beginning, a single victory in a much larger war. Iron City's corruption was resilient, constantly adapting, waiting for its next opportunity to rise again. And he would be there, waiting, watching, ready to strike when the time came. With a final glance at the city he had sworn to protect, the Shade slipped into the shadows, disappearing into the maze of Iron City's back alleys and hidden corners. He was a ghost, a myth, a dark figure with no name, no face, and no mercy for those who would harm the innocent. As he moved through the city, a sense of calm settled over him. He was part of Iron City now, as much as the streets, the buildings, and the people who called it home. He was its silent guardian, its protector, a force of justice that would never rest, no matter how many battles lay ahead. And as he disappeared into the fading darkness, Iron City began to awaken, oblivious to the figure who kept watch over it, defending it from those who would seek to corrupt and destroy it. The Shade was a legend, a flicker in the dark, a symbol of hope for those who needed it most. He would be there, always, a silent guardian in the night, a hero Iron City never knew it needed, and yet, the one it could not live without.